It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that right now.
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit. It hit another building. Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion.
We are breaking into this special live coverage of what's happening at the World Trade Center in New York to tell you about something going on right here at the Pentagon. You are looking at both pictures. The smoke that you see on the left-hand side of your screen is right here in the Washington area at the Pentagon.
Looks like the helipad area of the Pentagon over towards 395. There were reports of an explosion. People said the building shook.
They felt the building shake, and they're evacuating that building. We're also getting...
On the morning of September 11, 2001, I was on the mall entrance parking deck at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, when the United States suffered its worst terrorist attack to date. I'm one of maybe a dozen survivors who actually witnessed the attack on the Pentagon. I drove my wife to her workplace in Arlington, Virginia, to help her move as renovations were pending. I waited outside while Denise ran back in to write some last-minute memos in response to unfolding events of concern to her office. Suddenly, a deafening roar, a sickening silence, a reverently hushed thud, pellets of plastic and metal and stone sloshed over the roof, raining down before me. A concussion finding momentary harmony in concrete, metal, and flesh. Screams of 1,000 demons from hell in discordant unity, exhaling a boiling, angry heat, full of the blended vapors of fury and fire, desks and phones, ceiling tiles, jet fuel, computers, paper, and people. A dawning certainty that my wife was part of the ever-expanding inferno bearing down to consume me, my skin recoiling as it begins to burn with the searing heat of a sun, my grieving for children at home alone, about to be orphaned by fire. Then the cloud inhaling upon itself, sucking up into the sky. Thus have 4 seconds of my life passed. As soon as the plane hit the building, I jumped from my car and I started running toward the building and realized I wouldn't be allowed inside. And I ran back to the car and grabbed my cell phone, probably like thousands of other people were doing here and in New York, and I started calling. And first I called my wife's office and I let the phone ring, must have been 30 times, and there was no answer. And I had 2 overwhelming urges at that time. The first was that I wanted to go home to my children. I didn't know if they were attacking military installations elsewhere, and I wanted to get them off of the fort, take them somewhere safe, wherever safe was. At the same time, even though I was under the conviction that my wife was already dead, I couldn't leave without knowing. I had to stay and find out. So I called Denise's sister at the Department of Education, and I begged her to go get our children. "I can't," she screamed. "I have to get my sister." I begged her some more. "You go get the kids," she screamed. "I'm going to get my sister." And I tried to calm myself and explain to her that she couldn't get in, I couldn't get out. But there wasn't any reasoning with her at that point. I think her primal instincts had kicked in, and I didn't have the heart to tell her that I believed her sister was already dead. And I went back to the car and sat down and started praying. I laid my head down on the steering wheel and just prayed, God, please, I need you now. Just be with me now. And I started putting my mind in order, realizing that I had 2 children I had to raise, and that my wife was gone. And I sat that way for a few minutes until I sat up and I looked across the parking deck. And I saw all the way over at the end a short little lady, very dark skin, with the green uniform on, searching for someone. And she finally turned around and I saw that it was Denise and that she'd made it out okay. And as soon as we saw each other, just like in the movies, we ran in slow motion, it seemed, and grabbed each other and hugged each other. And I think I was the first one to ask, where were you when? And I asked her, where were you when it hit? She was in her office, after all, preparing her memos and worrying about her oldest son who lives in Manhattan. She was distracted by a noise and glanced out her window in time to see Flight 77 on its final approach. It dropped below the horizon of the roofline of the newly renovated Wedge, directly across the courtyard from her. There was no time to run, no time to warn, just time to watch in stunned horror as a second later it hit. The fireball mushroomed before her as her thoughts now turned to her friends of the Army staff side, who had just moved back into the new section. Some of them were fellow Army Guard. Collecting herself, she moved quickly to the hall to alert unbelieving ears to evacuate the building. And of my children at home alone, they received a call from their Aunt Carrie about the accident at the World Trade Center earlier, and with a sly inquiry about the whereabouts of their mother. And they went, like curious children, and turned on the television just in time to see the plane hit Tower 2 of the World Trade Center and wonder at the fate of their brother in Manhattan. And soon the New York coverage was interrupted with breaking news from the Pentagon. The bone-chilling scream that escaped my daughter's lips as she collapsed to the floor brought a neighbor running from the house next door. She believed her parents were dead. And of course, we weren't dead, and Denise managed, on her way out of the building, to slip a phone call out. And miracle of miracles, she was actually able to reach the house and talk to the children. So they were aware before I was that she did indeed survive, and she was looking for me. From the mall parking deck, we were evacuated down the grassy slope past the heliport to Washington Boulevard, where police were hastily stringing tape around the site. All of us glanced back, like Lot's wife, to the inferno raging before the heliport. Fire and smoke, joy and relief, guilt and grief, all swirled together as we watched the hungry flames. I felt guilt and grief, knowing Denise was alive because others were dead and dying, while simultaneously I felt joy in having her alive. She's alive, they're dead, and now I stand in the middle of the highway and touch her and know that it's done. A few moments later, a shot went up. The police officer came running at us with his arms waving in the air, pushing us back, telling everybody to run, that there was another plane that had been hijacked and it was on its way into the Pentagon. So Denise and I and about 900 other people down on the highway had to run towards Roslyn, Virginia. And in the crush, although it wasn't a panicked run, people were definitely determined to save their lives and were very obedient, and we ran. For a few moments, I lost track of Denise. And this is what I wrote to my family. People break between Denise and I, running. I see only bits and pieces of her as the distance grows. Now a calf, now a shoe, now a shoulder, like the little bits of debris back on the parking deck. Focus on the pieces, I tell myself. Don't let her slip away again. And my stomach drops. I hear her shout, "Timmy." She always calls me Timothy or Tim, never Timmy unless in a panic. I shouted back through the crush, "I'm here." I dropped back a few paces and found an opening and dove through and came in behind her. "I'm here. I'm here." And she reached back. I grabbed her hand and I felt her skin again. If we're to die in the next few moments, we at least have fair warning, and we're together. We ran on like this for, I guess, at least a quarter to half a mile, running down towards Memorial Bridge. And I remember I kept looking over my shoulder across the river to Washington every few seconds just to check to see if the monument, the Washington Monument, was still standing. I somehow found that reassuring to see it gleaming in the sun across the river, and kept going. And finally, when the bulk of us had gotten far enough away from the building that we felt a little safer, the pace slowed to a brisk walk. Of course, all of Washington at that point was shut down. We tried getting information from the park police about the metro. We were trying desperately to find a way to get back home. But of course, the metro was shut down because it runs directly under the Pentagon. So that route was cut off to us. Buses weren't running. Everybody was on foot. So at that point, we really had no choice but just to turn around and walk back into Virginia and head back toward the Pentagon. In the interim, a phone call came through to us. And it was my sister-in-law, Carrie, who had left the Department of Education as she promised, and by some miracle had driven all the way to the Pentagon through the traffic, got her car into the south parking lot, ditched it, ran to the building, and had to be dragged kicking and screaming and clawing from the south entrance doors. She was determined to go in and get her sister. We just continued our walk back to the Pentagon, and we stood on the highway and watched the building burn. It had been some hours since the attack, and the flames were still pretty ferocious. There was nothing you could do but think about the people who were still inside, hopefully dead, but knowing that some of them were probably trapped and still alive, and going through who knows what. We kept making calls, and we were able finally to get a call through to Manhattan and reached our son, who, as it turned out, was at home when the attacks occurred, 60 blocks away from the World Trade Center. And he was fine. And again, from the email, the three of us shared our joy over an open cell phone line. Michael in Manhattan, gazing 10 floors below to the street jammed with people fleeing from lower Manhattan, and us standing on the highway watching the Pentagon burn. And I think of an old nursery rhyme we used to sing as kids, except under my breath I sang new words. Guilt, guilt, go away. Come again another day. We finally, after some hours, made our way around the complex by traveling around the northern perimeter over to the south side, meeting people on the way that Denise knew and finding out who was okay and who was missing. And we got all the way over to Pentagon City. And a block away, there was one Metro bus. The street was jammed with thousands of people, thousands of cars. Just seemed like total gridlock, but there was one bus moving. And it stopped. And the doors opened, and a woman leaned out and started waving and screaming. And from a block away, Denise spotted her sister, Carrie, who was on the bus and was forcefully holding it in place, screaming, "That's my sister, that's my sister." So we fought our way through the crowd for a block and got to the bus and got on. And it took about 3 hours to get from the Pentagon the few miles up Route 1 to Fort Belvoir. So it was about 6 o'clock by the time we actually reached the fort. And of course the bus driver had to abandon us at the gate when the little man with the machine gun told him to stop. So we walked the rest of the way home. The next morning, my wife and thousands of others rose before dawn. And they quietly pulled on their uniforms, white, blue, khaki, and green. And traveling by foot or by thumb, begging, borrowing, and sharing rides, they arrived on time at their desks and put in an honest day's work getting the nation's business done. I am reminded of a definition of the word terrorism that I read recently in an article by Marilyn von Savant. She defined terrorism as the use of violence against civilians to promote a cause so unpopular that it cannot succeed without intimidation. And I think that's about the best description of the word I've ever heard.